Our next group of plants to cover are the monocots. And the monocots is a group that you're somewhat familiar with from earlier biology courses, but we need to clear up a few things that were maybe a little bit oversimplified before. We'll kind of do that along the way. Monocots are a really, really important group. We're going to cover lots of what will seem like kind of trivial little side groups of monocots, but then monocots include some very, very big, very important groups of plants. So some highlights here in this. In the field, the characteristics that you'll use the most to identify monocots are parallel leaf venation and flower parts in threes or multiples of threes. And in general, that works out fairly well. Um, the parallel venation part of the leaf, that doesn't work so well, and I'll talk about some examples of that. Um, One other trait that actually is much more consistent than any of these other things is how many little holes or colpi the pollen grains have. So of most other, well, all other plants that have pollen, they will have multiple colpi. The bottom image here shows a grain of pollen with 3 furrows, and in the middle of those furrows, like right about here-ish, will be a little hole kind of buried in the bottom of that furrow. So this is a tricolpate pollen grain. In monocots, every monocot, they have one hole, one place where the pollen germinates out of, and that makes them very unique. It's one of the best traits actually to separate out monocots from all other plants. So it's a monocolpate pollen grain. Unfortunately, that's not super useful for identifying plants in the field, but it has been a really, really good trait for looking at changes in the abundance and distribution of monocots throughout the world, because pollen gets retained very well in sediments for thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so that can be used as a record of how ancient plant groups have changed in, as I said, both the abundance and distribution throughout the world. You've seen this phylogenetic tree, this relationship of evolutionary groupings of plants. And monocots form a very distinct, very unique group. This is a monophyletic group, so we could take one snip of the phylogenetic tree right here and we would get all the monocots. We talked briefly last time about some of these groups called paleoherbs. We also talked about some pines, which were down here. We're only looking at flowering plants right here, so the pines would be sort of off of this chart here. And notice that one of the distinctive features here of monocots and these paleoherbs is that they're all or mostly herbaceous. So this is a trait that arose early on in the phylogenetic history of these groups. And so what we'll see when we get to the monocots is that most of them, pretty much all of them, are herbaceous. Again, I mentioned that there's one cotyledon, there's parallel venation. These traits arose as distinct in the monocots. There are a few exceptions as we go on. So as I mentioned before, monocots are highly, highly diverse. There's lots and lots of species that are monocots, especially in particular families. They are highly abundant, so they may or may not be species rich, but they occur pretty much everywhere. Everywhere you look, you'll be able to find some monocots. And they have several plant groups that are highly useful, and I'm going to highlight some of those as we go along. Just a quick reminder, as we're going through families, I think it's useful to try to keep track of, and I will be giving you this information on the left, how many species there are in the world, and that's going to be approximate. How many there are in the US approximately, how many there are in Alabama, any distinctive features, their utility, and then any unique notes, a little bit of trivia sometimes about different plant families. And again, my suggestion is, as you're going through plant families, try to keep a top 5 list of families in the world and in the US, and maybe even in Alabama as well. All the rest of them just kind of lump into, are there a lot of species in that group, but maybe not a ton? Or do they have very, very few species in that particular group or that family? And then try to remember maybe 2 or 3 things that are especially noteworthy per family, and that might be either in the distinctive, the utility, or in the notes section of what I try to give you. And then again, as you're going through all these families, because there's going to be a lot of information that I'm going to gloss over real quickly, only try to keep your eyes open for any particular comparisons that are of especially unique interest, such as they're all monoecious or they're all herbaceous. And I just told you a bunch of things about monocots that you could already sort of list for all of these monocots. All the monocots that we're going to talk about are typically herbaceous, with just a couple exceptions here and there. So again, we're going to come back to this phylogenetic tree, which has been modified a little bit, but it's useful enough for where we're going. So we've covered so far these first few lineages towards the base of this phylogeny, and we're now moving into this monocot lineage, and that's going to be the topic of what we'll cover today. And if we expand this out to here, the orders that we're going to focus on are the Elismatales, Liliales, Asparagales, Poales, and Comelinales. Now, I want to point out something. For example, the Liliales, that is an order, there will be something called a type family. And the type family is, so it is the most representative family in that order. And you can imagine that the most representative family of the Liliales is going to be the Liliaceae, the family that is the type family for this order. And then anything with the genus of Lily will be a type genus of that family and also of that order. So you can think of the types as being sort of the distinctive representatives of that larger taxonomic group. Okay, that's just a quick aside. If that didn't really register, that's fine. But I just wanted to point that out because we're going to be talking about the Poaceae, a family in the Poales. There is some logic to how they lay these out. Okay, let's start here though in the Elismatales. It's one order that we're just going to highlight one family in, and that family is the Araceae. That family is pretty interesting. It's not super species rich. There's about 3,300 species in the world. There's about 40 in the US and only 8 in Alabama. I've mentioned these before when I talked about different kinds of inflorescences. So what is distinctive about this particular family is that it has a spadix and a spathe as part of the inflorescence. Now that's true of almost everything in this family, not these tiny things like duckweeds. This family ranges from very large plants that are very viney, like Monstra deliciosa, and the deliciosa signifies that it's actually edible. It includes some small herbaceous plants like the skunk cabbage. That's the one that can melt snow because it warms up in the wintertime. And it also includes the world's smallest flowering plant, things like duckweeds. Remember that this is the family that has the unique kind of feature, the spadix, which is the central part of the inflorescence that will have both male and female flowers on it, and then the spathe, think of it as like an enclosure that goes around the spadix and that inflorescence. Now many of the plants in this family are beetle or fly pollinated. They are often a little bit smelly, so they bring in things that are attracted to carrion. They include the largest inflorescence. So I said the smallest flowering plant, but this is also the family that has the largest inflorescence, and I've mentioned that one before in class. So there are a lot of edible plants in this family. Not a lot, but this is a starchy staple that's used in a lot of parts in the world, particularly in the New World, but it's also been spread to Africa. So this is Colocasia esculenta, and I've said this before in class, but anything with the specific epithet of esculenta means that the plant is edible. Now the plant is edible, the corms part of the plant. So this is an underground storage organ. And this underground storage organ is edible, but not unless you cook it. Uncooked, it contains a whole bunch of these needle-like structures known as rhaphides. And these rhaphides actually embed and lodge in the mouth of an herbivore like us or any other animal that eats the corms. But cooking denatures those rhaphides and breaks them down and makes them edible. Now this is not a terribly tasty plant, but in the New World, it's a pretty good source of starch, um, and it will be used in a lot of sort of Central American cooking. One local representative that we have here is Jack in the Pulpit, and often you'll look at it and go, oh, well, that's just poison ivy. It kind of looks like it has the same three leaflet pattern. But note how the venation of this leaf kind of goes out towards the edge of the leaf and then kind of turns in. So it doesn't really have the parallel venation that we would expect. In fact, this is pinnate venation. So you might look at this and say, well, that can't be a monocot because it doesn't have parallel venation. Parallel venation, recall, is supposed to start from the base of the leaf and go all the way to the apex and be parallel. Well, this doesn't really have that, so here's one of those exceptions. But it does have the spadix and the spathe, and here it is shown. You got to kind of look underneath the leaves to be able to see it. It has both carpellate and pistillate flowers, which is kind of interesting because a flower could be male, it could be female, or it could be hermaphroditic. And you'll see that the berries look very much like that large infructescence of that Titan arum that I showed you a slide or two ago. So that was our first order in the monocots. The next one that we're going to move down to is the asparagales. If we expand the asparagales, the Asparagaceae will be in here, and asparagus is a monocot, so no surprise. We're not going to feature that, but this is where asparagus lives. We're going to highlight several very important families in this group. We're going to start off with a not hugely important family, but relatively important, the Agavaceae. So agave is the type genus of the family Agavaceae. Agave is a useful plant because it's where we get tequila and mezcal from. This is a very cactus-like kind of plant. It tends to be more in arid areas, do well in fairly arid areas. It's more of a tropical kind of plant, not so much in northern temperate zones, although it will get in kind of northern Europe. And I should have said before that these are maps of sort of natural or native distribution. This is not necessarily where they're replanted. The centers of diversity, though, for this family tend to be in places like Mexico, other areas in Central America. So this is not a super species-rich family. There's 300 species in this family, and there's about 60 in the U.S. and only about 5 in Alabama. The utility for this particular plant is that you're able to pound the leaves and extract some fibers from it. So hemp is a kind of a fiber that gets derived from these plants. This is different from the other kind of hemp that comes from cannabis. And like I said before, this is where we get mezcal from. It's the fermented sugars from the leaves of this plant. Now the leaves tend to be somewhat succulent in some of these, and so that's where the source of sugar is that gets fermented for mezcal and for tequila. Like other members of the monocots, it has floral parts in threes, just like you would expect for any other member of a monocot group. And just like most of the other monocots, these are almost entirely herbaceous plants. Now we move on to a species group, a family that is not particularly species rich. There's 300 species in the world, but in terms of utility, the Alliaceae is a real important one. Now note here the worldwide distribution of the Alliaceae is almost all north of the equator. And in Europe, especially Central Europe, in Russia, and also in North America, there are not necessarily a lot of species, but they're highly, highly useful. So some features, there's about 300 species in the world, only 15 native to the US and 10 native to Alabama. They tend to have distinctive tubular round leaves, so they're round and hollow. Think back to that wild garlic that we found one of our first labs outside on campus, where you pull up the leaf and it kind of looks like chives. So chives is also in this family. And when you pull it apart, the leaves were hollow and they were round. They also all have bulbs, so their perenniating structure, the structure that allows them to sort of live from year to year, is this bulb. And remember that when we talked about bulbs, that these are storage organs with reduced leaves, fleshy leaves that surround a very, very small reduced stem. So garlic is in this family, onions are in this family, lots of useful food plants, even though it's not a super abundant group. One of the noteworthy features of the Alliaceae are these sulfur glycosides. And if you've ever cut onions, especially warm onions, and they make your eyes water like crazy and burn, it's because these sulfur glycosides get aerosolized, so they disperse into the air, and when they land in your tear ducts, they make an acid, which literally is not, causing permanent damage to your eyes, but that's why you get that reaction. The next family that we're going to talk about is the Iridaceae. Now this one gets all throughout the entire world in its native range, but with some spotty distributions. And irises don't tend to do well in particularly arid zones, so you see in the Sahara Desert, these high mountain regions, interior to Australia, they don't tend to do well there, but pretty much throughout the rest of the world they're going to be very abundant. 1,700 approximately species in the world, a little over 100 in the U.S., 22 in Alabama, which is pretty good. Again, like all the other members, or most of the other members of the monocot lineage, they have flower parts in threes. They are herbaceous. What makes irises a little bit more distinctive is that they all have rhizomes, so they are rhizomatous. So here is that underground stem that the leaves come out from. And what's weird about irises, what's kind of distinctive, is that these leaves tend to come out in a line. Now, if I were to be in person with you, what I would do is I would take my hand and stick my fingers straight up and my arm flat to the ground. And when I do that and I kind of spread my fingers out a little bit and point my fingers up, what you'll see is sort of a curved line that your fingers form towards the end of your hand and arm. Picture your arm and hand as being like the rhizome, and the place where your fingers are sticking straight up, that's the line that you see right here, and the line that you see right here in this image. So this would be like your hand or your arm, that's the rhizome, and this is your fingers sticking up above the ground. That's the line that is very distinctive of irises. With the flowers, very, very unique, very easy to identify, at least irises. But whenever you see them kind of growing in a line like this, you can put things in the Iridaceae fairly confidently. There's one plant that can be fairly easy to overlook until it flowers, and that is plants in the genus Cicericium, or blue-eyed grasses. Sometimes there are yellow-eyed grasses. Again, they will grow in a little line. It's kind of hard to see in this image, but if you saw an individual in the wild, you'd be able to see it. Flower parts in multiples of 3. And when it flowers, it's very distinctive. It looks like grass otherwise, but it comes up like this, and clearly blue-eyed grass. One other thing about the irises that makes them somewhat distinctive and kind of unique is that the styles, so the styles are actually right, the stigmatic surface is right underneath here. The styles are ornamented, and they also look a little bit like petals. So it will look like there's 3 sets of petals actually with an iris flower. In terms of utility, these guys are pretty much all ornamentals, although there is one spice that we get from one member of the Iridaceae, and that is saffron, which is actually pollen from the plant called Crocus sativus. So not a lot of utility other than being ornamentals, but as an ornamental they are extremely, extremely common, especially throughout Alabama.